Welcome back to Network Africa. Libya's UN-backed government says it will ask the U.S. President Donald Trump for an exemption to its new travel restrictions targeting 7 Muslim-majority nations. The government also criticized the temporary ban, which puts in question attendance of a high-profile conference in Libya planned in Washington, D.C. for mid-February.
GNA spokesman Ashraf Al-Tulti says that the Libyan government recognizes the security aspect and the rationale behind the U.S. decision, but the executive order was issued so quickly that it could affect the organization of their official agendas. The president can modify or cancel this order. There are exemptions to this decision, like diplomatic missions and other purposes. The visa types which will allow entry into the U.S. were specified. The American department in the Libya Foreign Ministry was assigned to issue a report on the effects of such a decision. The Libyan Foreign Minister will call the U.S. Secretary of State to ask for some exemptions. Al-Tulti, who was invited for the meeting of a National Council of the U.S.-Libya relations set to take place in Washington on February 16, says he hopes to receive his visa in time and that he will be able to participate and present political and economic points of view. Trump's Friday directive halted travel by people with passports from Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria and Yemen for 90 days and stopped the resettlement of refugees for 120 days.
This is what democracy looks like.
The ban prompted protests and chaos at airports on the weekend as customs officials struggled to put the order into practice, and the fallout spread to U.S. markets on Monday, January 30, where stocks suffered their biggest drop of 2017 and companies affected by the change spoke out against it. Meanwhile, the United Nations says it has concerns about some 850 refugees who were bound for the United States this week in the wake of President Donald Trump's executive order on immigration and refugees.
And after perhaps 4 years of waiting patiently to be resettled, they've sold their goods, they've given away their settlement in a refugee camp where they may have been for 2 decades. They've lost their livelihood, given away their job, handed back their ration card, only to be told, at the last minute and rather cruelly, that to go back to the refugee camp. So that's what we're concerned about, is their protection, their security, their safety. I think that's certainly it's IOM's focus at the present time.
According to the UN Agency for Refugees, these 850 were scheduled to leave this week for the U.S. and were at the very last stage of the process of resettlement, which can take up to 2 years, meaning that they had gone through security screening and checks carried out by the agency, but also by U.S. authorities, and there was now a lot of uncertainty about their fate.
We are also worried about the uncertainty faced by 20,000 refugees who could have been resettled if we take into account the numbers that we've seen in the last 15 years. On average, it means that 20,000 refugees might have been resettled in the 120 days period of this suspension.
The IOM, however, refused to criticize the U.S. president's decision to suspend entry of refugees, saying that every country in the world had the right to determine who would come across its borders and that up to now, the United States had contributed for the greatest part to the refugee resettlement program and called on other countries to welcome refugees.
Agadez in northern Niger, once a busy staging post for tens of thousands of West African refugees being smuggled into Europe, is today empty of migrants. It is also struggling to redefine its local economy as the government cracks down on traffickers in return for huge cash incentives and investment from the European Union.
In a dirt-floored room in the town of Agadez in Niger, scattered paper and a cold pile of ashes are all that remains of what was once a teeming stopover for migrants preparing for the journey across the Sahara Desert and onwards to Europe. This empty room, with messages like "Remember me" etched on the clay walls, housed hundreds of migrants at a time. Boubacar Lou was one of them.
This ghetto was one of the biggest ghettos in Agadez. It could shelter between 50 and 100 people. The number of people that used to live here was around 500 people. And every Monday, trucks would come and pick people up, and there would be at least 200 people left. Unfortunately, today, things have changed.
Less than a year ago, Agadez boomed. It was a hub for smuggling networks that profited off hundreds of desperate migrants. But that was before the European Union, working with Niger's government, bankrolled a crackdown on the trade. Representatives at the International Organization for Migration, which monitors migrant flows at 2 points in the Agadez region, says numbers have fallen dramatically. We can say that the numbers have decreased since the month of August, whereas before we used to see large numbers going through every week. Now the number is between 0 and a dozen. But I would like to emphasize that it does not mean that there are no migrants in Niger just because we are on the ground, only in those two areas. Agadez has been the focus of anti-smuggling efforts, and the EU began training security forces there in April. By November, authorities had seized 95 vehicles and arrested 102 smugglers, as well as 9 police officers for migration-linked corruption. In late 2015, the EU established a fund with 1.88 billion euros aimed at addressing migration originating across West Africa's arid Sahel and Lake Chad regions, the Horn of Africa, as well as North Africa. Last year, it added another 500 million euros to that fund and established partnerships with priority countries Niger, Ethiopia, Senegal, Mali, and Nigeria.
Somalia's outgoing Prime Minister Omar Abdurrashid Shamanke has accused neighboring countries of intervening in the country's presidential elections. Members of parliament are due to elect the president later next week. Mr. Shamanke, who is also standing as a candidate, said at a press conference in the capital Mogadishu that Somalis should be left to decide their own destiny independently. Ethiopia contributes soldiers to the 22,000-strong African Union force AMISOM in the country. Uganda, Djibouti and Kenya are also among other contributors. Mr. Shamanke, who is said to have support from Kenya in his political effort, says the Somali parliament does not need any help when it comes to choosing its leaders. And that's it on Network Africa. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Temitope Fagbemi.